Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we approach the holidays, many of us can sometimes feel that sort of pinch or longing or maybe even emptiness or sadness when it comes to realizing there was a time that we spent holidays with a significant other. Sometimes we ask the question as we break apart from a relationship, what was it that we could have done that could have allowed this to continue? Some of us reached out and tried to seek love through other relationships, hoping to patch up perhaps a wound that could have been avoided in the first place, should we have had the proper tools and understanding about what love is and what the expectation of each other was as far as making the relationship work. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's been teaching couples therapy for more than 30 years. Her newest book is Love Cycles, which is the 5 essential stages of lasting love. She's here to talk about how we can deal with the love that is cyclical and comprised of 5 distinct stages known as the merge, doubt and denial, disillusionment and decision, and wholehearted loving. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Linda Carroll. Linda, welcome back to the Beyond 50 radio program. Great to have you.
Thanks.
Now, tell us how you came about Love Cycles. 30 years of couples therapy, you could have probably started to see patterns that people were, that they could actually avoid or learn more about to avoid something like that.
Well, actually, the way that this started is I was on a plane, and I was reading one of those airline magazines, and it was a kind of a Dear Abby question there in it, and the question was, Dear whoever it wasn't Abby, dear someone, I am no longer in love with my husband. What should I do? And the person answered and said, well, if you're not in love, it probably means the relationship is over. So you should find a good lawyer. I was so stunned at this answer that I was going to give a keynote somewhere, and I began to talk about that. That was how I opened. And as I did, it actually kind of came out of me, and I said, this answer represents a cultural belief we have that love and long-term love is a feeling, and in fact, it isn't true. And what I said became the thesis for the book. I said, romantic love is a sentiment, wholehearted love, and a love that lasts is a skill set. And that was how the book was formed. It just came about sort of naturally. And then somebody said, you have to write a book, and I said, no way. And 5 years later, here I am.
You kind of think to yourself, well, what would I know about love relationships, and who am I to be the professional in this area? But you can see as you were reading that airline magazine is that, there's a real need for people to understand that love isn't something that you just feel that romantic sense of loving connection, the honeymoon phase, as it's so eloquently called, but that it goes beyond and more than that, and you take a look at many shows that are out there that really are kind of, in many ways, modeling what the belief of love truly is, that I think a lot of people get thrown into a disillusion, which happens to be one of the stages or cycles that you talk about here, about what it truly is.
Well, yes. Well, love is a feeling. I mean, that's the bottom line. Love is a feeling, and when we fall in love in that first romantic stage, it's mediated by all kinds of chemicals and brain changes, and it's a great feeling. It's a total high, but it's not good evidence to choose a life partner from. And so what I say to people is enjoy the ride, have a great time. But this idea that the deeper and stronger the feeling, the more certain this is the right person, is absolutely trouble. Because we can fall in love with a jerk, a jerkette. We can fall in love with the absolutely wrong person and miss every red flag. So it's not a judgment about romantic love. It's just saying what it is not necessarily where we make a choice of a life partner from.
Now, I know one of the things that really stood out in your book where I actually was thinking to myself, in fact, over the weekend, I thought it was such an interesting thing when you talk about communication, and that a lot of books are written out there that tend to share with us how important it is for us to express our feelings, what's on our mind, and not to really be afraid of that, to be fearless, if you will. But you sort of turned that around and said, but wait a minute, what about learning how to be on the receiving end of somebody who's expressing what's on their mind? And I think to myself, the truth is, how often do we really listen, really wholeheartedly listen on the receiving end? We more or less, okay, I want to hear what's on your mind. What are you feeling? What are you thinking? But what we're really doing is saying, come on, get it out so I can kind of give you my retort, if you will.
That's exactly right. I think that so much communication is real. I mean, what people often will say, they'll say two things when they come in my office. They'll say, I'm not in love with my partner anymore, or they'll say, we need to communicate. And here are these two people communicating wonderfully to me. And what they're really saying is one of two things. They're either saying, we need to communicate under stress, because it's very different when you're under stress, or they're saying, we need to communicate in such a way that my partner hears what I'm saying and believes it. So much of communication is really about, I want you to see my point of view and agree, rather than to create a bridge. And it's much harder to create that bridge between oneself and another person, where I can actually have a sense of and hear and understand your point of view, even if I don't agree with it, and you can do the same for me. That is hard work. That's a practice, it's a skill, and it's an intention to say, I'm willing to put aside what I think should happen here in order to hear what you have to say. And boy, do we have a lot of blocks to doing that.
Mm-hmm. Linda, it's so true, too. And I kind of wonder, first of all, for our listeners out there, what is the average relationship time that people finally decide they need to come and talk with you? And generally, about what stage are they at? Do you see pretty much patterns emerging in something like this?
I've seen changes in the past decade. When I first started doing this 35 years ago, the people who came to counseling were on death's door of relationship. And things were so bad, it was the very last stop. And now I see people come in all kinds of ways where they're on a new, or older people in a new relationship, and they want to do it well, and they understand that relationships are a skill set. Or maybe there are people who have enough educational background, listen to programs like yours, and really believe that we can learn things that can make every part of our life better, not just golf lessons or computer classes, but also the skills for making love work. And they come in when they're not in really bad trouble. They're just kind of stuck. And that has increased, and I don't know a number, but I know that it's increased enormously, that people come in for. In fact, we had a couple take our class who were in their mid-80s. Their kids had taken our Love Cycles program in Corvallis, and they told their parents, and their parents had been married for 60-plus years. And they said, well, I think it's time we had a tune-up. And they were wonderful. They came in the class, they did the whole thing, and they really worked hard. And they were not going to leave each other. But, there were some things that they learned that took their relationship to a place that really surprised them. So I think it's changed so much, just like our understanding. Well, I think another part that's changed is that that a lot of relationship, what I would call relationship counseling, is really learning skills. It's psychoeducation. So it's not that there's something wrong. It's that there's something to learn that can make a good relationship better. So I see a lot of people who want to make a good relationship better.
Now, you had mentioned about a couple that decided to attend the workshop in their 80s. And it reminded me many years ago when I was in the services industry that I was actually serving a couple. And at the end of the service that was coming to the time it was ready to drop the check for them to pay the bill, I just finally decided to have some fun. It was just in my character to do the off-the-wall thing. And I said, the two of you need to quit talking to each other so much. It doesn't seem like anyone can get a word in edgewise. And the lady looked up at me, sharp as you can just imagine, and she says, after 65 years of marriage, you sort of run out of things to say. And I thought to myself as you were talking, and I just remembered this couple, it didn't seem like they were complacent or irritated, but relationships that long, 65 years, does it really get to a place where you just don't have a whole lot to say to each other anymore? It seems as though the adventure has disappeared, or, the patterns are maybe a long rut. I don't know the best way to put this. Does that happen, and is that avoidable?
Oh, I think, this goes into a whole other topic that I think your boomer audience certainly thinks about if they don't talk about. In our relationships in later years, we have, one of the awarenesses that we have is that just like in all cycles, we're in a cycle. Our bodies are changing, and those changes, some of them are very hard, they're very painful. And you know what? Nobody gets to the finish line at the same time, or usually that's not true. And people in their later years have a lot on their mind in terms of their mortality, in terms of losing often their hearing or their knees or their ability to run, and eventually facing mortality. And if a couple is truly engaged in a conversation, they have so much to talk about, because the problem that we have is one problem is the idea that we're finished, that we really can know our partner. Every stage and every season brings new awarenesses of self, every single one, and there is if we're conscious enough where we're exploring or examining what's going on with us, that all of these different seasons bring their own challenges and gifts. We have kids leaving, we have kids coming back, we have parents dying, we have illnesses, we have friends getting sick, we have all of the we have retirement or not retirement, depending on what our situation is. But we have my friends and I talk all the time about our memories. And I have a couple in the book I talk about who had really reached a great place in their relationship, and then they started having these terrible arguments about who said what. And the woman finally said, you know what? I think that what's really happening here is our memories are going, and we're scared. And so we're arguing so dramatically with each other about who said what, because we don't want to be wrong. We don't want to look at the fact that our memory isn't what it was. So my point in all of this is that we are changing all the time. We have new challenges, new gifts, and if we're able to talk about that with ourselves, to recognize that with ourselves, we have a lifetime of conversation with our partner.
Certainly life is a wonderful adventure, depending on the fact that you actually get out and make it that way, I would think.
Yeah.
Just recently, Linda, I had the marvelous privilege of interviewing Ginger Alden, who is best known as the final love and fiancé of Elvis Presley.
All right. Okay.
And what was really interesting about her book is, as I was telling her, I said, what I loved about reading about this, and I'd never read another book, biography or story about Elvis Presley until this, which just recently came out. And what I noticed is, first of all, there was about a 22-year age difference between the two of them as they got together, and they spent 9 months together up until his death, and they were actually slated to be married that year on Christmas, and it just, of course, he passed away in August of 1977. But what I noticed in the book was that at that sort of a difference, and this isn't about the age difference here more than the idea that Elvis seemed to be, demanding, I want you here, I want you to be sure that you're at my shows, and pretty soon you started to sense in the story that she was beginning to kind of lose her identity a bit. She wasn't spending time with her friends and pursuing her interest, and finally she starts talking about that in the book, and I started realizing how often in relationships, especially after that honeymoon phase ends, that one person seems to surrender that part of themselves as the other one becomes dominant. Now, I'm sure you see that quite often in your workshops and retreats, don't you? Oh,
sure. I mean, that's, we have these double instincts that are always at war with each other until we find some way maybe to let them be at peace. But one is to be ourselves, is to be an individual, and the other is to merge. And usually in a relationship, one person holds the flag for merging, and that's a person who gives up their identity more. The other is a person who holds the flag for their identity, for being separate. And I think that that is, but that's also a cycle. When we first fall in love, there is nothing more yummy than to connect with the other person. We want to lose ourselves in them because we feel like we found our other half. And then as we go through some time together, we start to yearn to get ourselves back. Now, sometimes people can get stuck. One person wants to pull themselves away from the relationship, and the other person says, no, don't go. I want to be all merged up. And often that's the person that stays so focused on their partner that they forget they have a self. But I think at least the people that I see eventually get that back, because if they don't, it makes a lot of trouble.
What I would like you to do, Linda, if you could, for our listeners, is let's go ahead and go through each of the 5 essential stages that you describe here in your book, just briefly to kind of outline what they were, because I kind of got a feeling as I was reading about them, sort of a seasonal sense, like this is the spring of love, and you can imagine then there's the summer, the fall, and the winter, and kind of give us an idea of what that is all about.
Okay. In our culture, we certainly have romantic love as the entry for many people. Not all people enter at that. Some people get into relationships because they feel like it's time, or because it seems to be because their biological clock is ticking. I see a lot of people like that. But I think most of us, romantic love is the siren song that brings us in, where we notice another person and we notice them very strongly, and in a very short amount of time our life changes pretty profoundly. And I call that the merge, romantic love, where it's and there's in that stage we really feel like we have found our other half. That there is this sense of there's a sense of mystery. We, in the 90s, we heard the word soulmate a lot, which thank goodness is no longer a word because it's a lot of trouble.
I think, like you, I became rather irritated, even as a show host, to see books coming out like that. Oh, I have found my soulmate, but I never sensed there was really a true definition of what that really was.
No, I think what it was that, we felt a lot of the romantic cocktail. The goddess of love, Aphrodite, had a son named Cupid. And we all know, when we think of Cupid, we see a picture of that little angelic figure with an arrow. And Aphrodite would say, dip your arrow in the potion and aim it at that person. And from that came some of the greatest love stories we've had. Well, what we know now is that the potion that Cupid dipped his arrow in was full of chemicals. And if you measure the brain chemicals of people in the new stage of romantic love, you find all sorts of chemicals. You find, for instance, a lot of dopamine. And dopamine is the addiction chemical, the craving chemical. It's what happens when we check our iPhone or our messages, and why people get so addicted to that. We have that part of, when you have a lot of dopamine, you have unwavering motivation and craving. Another component of that romantic cocktail is norepinephrine, which causes us not to need to eat or sleep. People say love is the best diet there is. When you have a lot of those chemicals in your brain, you have a reduction of serotonin, and that creates a sense of something that's very like OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, doesn't this sound like romantic love? Unwavering motivation, loss of appetite, OCD. And this is, and I'm going to tell you the 5 stages, but recently I had somebody who was 92 years old come in, and this was a man who had been in a 60-plus year marriage. and had it was a good marriage. He'd never been romantically in love with this person, but they'd had a good, long, rich time, and he'd gone to a reunion. And there were probably only 7 or 8 people from this very large class in a big city, so a class reunion. But he was one of the survivors. It was the first time he ever went. He fell in love with his high school sweetheart. And this man came in, and he looked like he was on drugs. And he said, I've never felt this. I don't know what to do. I'm walking around in a trance. I feel like I walk into walls. It was the first time he'd ever fallen in love. So I just want to say that sometimes Cupid will hit us with that arrow when we least expect it. It isn't just 18-year-olds that have that experience. Throughout our whole life, we can feel that. And what happens in that first stage is that the center of our safety center, a part of our brain gets awash in chemicals, and we lose our objectivity. So one of the things I say in the first stage, the merge with romantic love, is enjoy it. Have a great time, but don't make life decisions in that stage because you don't see all of it. You only see everything that's right. Now, there's diminishing returns on those chemicals, and what happens after a period of time, 3 years, they say, the first time, and then each time we fall in love, it's less. We move into the second stage, sometimes called the power struggle. I call it doubt and denial. And what happens in that second stage is we begin to feel something's wrong. We start to notice that the things we fell in love with begin to irritate us. You know, my husband fell in love with me because one of the things he used to say in the early days was, you're the most generous person I've ever met. I love how you give money away to every cause, to everybody standing on the street corner, especially if they have a dog. I just think it's amazing because I don't do that. And then we got married and we put our money together. We have the same checkbook. Suddenly,
pretty soon he's giving your money away.
pretty soon he was saying, instead of generosity, he was complaining that I was impulsive.
Oh, boy.
It no longer looked wonderful. To him, it's suddenly that very same quality had a different energy to it. So the things we fall in love with, we start to feel critical of those very things. Another thing about the doubt and denial is we move into power struggles. We find out we're not the same. We find out that we are different, and something will come up, and we will suddenly realize that this is not a soulmate at all. In fact, we couldn't be more different. You know, in the beginning, people who've never gone backpacking go with their new lover and love it and say, isn't this wonderful? And their new lover goes to the opera with them. But as the love potion wears off, and as Cupid pulls his arrow out, and we go back to the way of being, the person who's gone off to the woods camping suddenly remembers why they never liked it. All these bugs and the discomfort of living on the floor. And the person who's gone to the opera says, what did I ever do this for? This is crazy. I want to go back to the woods. So we go back to the ways that we've been. We become more conditional. And we have a lot of, and then what happens is we also become more defensive. Mm-hmm. And we start to hear our partner complaining, and we complain. And then we move into the third stage. This second stage takes a long time. The third stage is disillusionment or disenchantment. It's the opposite of stage one. It's where we were in that first stage. It's as though we're in a trance, and all we see is what's right. In the third stage, all we see is what's wrong. Mm-hmm. And everything becomes evidence. That evidence accrues that we're with the wrong person. What have we done? We have new chemicals that come in, which are the chemicals of stress and anxiety. And so when our partner walks into the room, instead of feeling so wonderful and happy, what we feel is protective and defensive, especially if we've not learned the skills for how to complain or protest and how to also keep goodwill going, which is an important part of it.
You know, Linda, on that particular one, disillusionment, I couldn't help but wonder, and I'm sharing sort of a personal experience here on this, if that isn't the time that people should really step back and rather than becoming argumentative and sort of taking a stand about, this is what's been bugging me about everything about you, like, for it could be your laugh, or as you were mentioning, going hiking and going to the opera. This is a point where, as you say, they begin to create self-protective strategies and have grudges. And here's one I want to share, and the reason is I find that if people could, when they're in this stage and they recognize this is happening and begin to see the humor in it, they begin to appreciate the difference in their partner rather than looking for all the similarities of why they're a soulmate. And it's this. My wife and I, we have been together for now just over 10 years. It's the longest relationship I've ever been in. And one of the things that over time that I began noticing immediately is how she does the laundry. Okay? Now, here it is, folks. I mean, this is one of these things I'm just going to throw out there now. She'll tend to just pick anything up that's dirty and throw it into the washer. Okay? And I think, who taught you how to do this, okay? Generally you do the whites with the whites and this and that and the other, but for her, it's everything goes in there. And the other thing that's been phenomenal is how much of a load she feels a washing machine is capable of handling. There'll be 2 or 3 blankets, 5 towels, and I mean, this is just a regular house-size washing machine. And I think to myself, do you understand that although this is a machine, it has limitations at the same time, okay? Yes. So, you look at this and you realize, okay, you talk with her, could you please do this, okay? And for 10 years, I can honestly say, Linda, she has never, ever changed her laundry habits, no matter how much I implore, to the point that finally we had to replace the washing machine because it just couldn't be fixed. But I had this washer set for more than 15 years, and finally it just died and it couldn't be repaired anymore. And I was upset about it, okay? And I said, look, for this many years I've been saying over and over and over, could you please do this, to the point where a lot of times I would jump in and just do the laundry just so I can avoid seeing what I would see to become inevitable, okay? Yes. But it got to a point where it could have been after 5 or 6 years, it took that long, where I started recognizing the humor in it, because I realized there is nothing about this that's going to change that I'm aware of, unless I start making her buy out of her own pocket the cost of replacing this. Again, it lasted for quite a long time before it couldn't be replaced anymore, but so I would say things like, it surprises me that I didn't find my toolbox in there today, and perhaps that kayak oar, and things like that. And I began to see more humor in it. And after a while, I began to realize, it wasn't about changing her in as much as I would have loved for that habit to turn better, but that there was just a lot of humor in it, that no one probably did laundry quite like she does. But in that stage of disillusionment, to be able to find the humor in things like that, I guess.
That's so important, isn't it, to be able to laugh. Here's another trick. This is a hard one because I have a similar thing, but I did something a little different with it. I had an issue with my husband, who I would say is a dropper. He will clean the kitchen and do a wonderful job, but he'll leave a sponge and 2 coffee cups, and he'll say it's clean. Or he'll do the backyard, and it'll be wonderful. He'll do wonderful work, but he'll see there'll be the hose not put away and a shovel. And we went through this for years. He'd say, oh, I've done all this work in the yard, and he'd been there for 7 hours. I'd look out, what would I see? Instead of all the beautiful trimming and planting that he had done, what I would see is the one shovel. Mm-hmm. And I would think, why can't he put that away? And then one day, I had a shocking revelation. And what that was, Daniel, was that I realized that I have a problem with keys. I have some kind of brain difficulty where I can't remember where I've put keys. And I thought about how patient he was, how he doesn't complain. He goes to look for the keys. He says, do you have them? I'll say, oh, no, I can't remember. He'll quietly look for them and not berate me in any way. And I started to think, I have as many things about me that are annoying as he has about him. That was a humble day. And I began to change the way I looked at those shovels and coffee cups in the kitchen, because I would started to retrain myself and thought, you know what? I'm not so easy to live with either. What we see when we look out is we see the other person. We see their annoying way of doing laundry or the dishes or the lawn, but we don't see the ways that are annoying about us. And I call that reframing. And it's one of the skills I teach people. Sometimes people don't like the skill in particular, but being able to see how really our partner puts up with a lot with us, just like we do with them.
Now, is this that particular cycle and disillusionment that you find relationships become to a state where they're unfolding and people are saying, I've just had it, it's just better to walk away and try somewhere else?
Just because they're tired of that round fight, I call it the infinity loop. I explain that in a lot more detail in the book, as we go round and round with the same things, and what's really in that loop. And if we don't break that loop, we start to think the loop is the relationship. And at this point, people come into my office and say, we're so tired of the fight, and we have to stop. And the way to do that is to leave. Well, I think that certainly if you're in danger or you really know it's done, then that's what you need to do. But I really believe that if we can, in that stage of disillusionment, where everything is wrong just like everything was right in the first stage, if we are willing to work in that stage, to do some work, to really look and see what our part of the trouble is, which is the last thing we see, and to learn some skills to be able to reclaim some of the friendship at least. Sometimes people turn it around dramatically because what they realize is they were stuck in a loop, and they wanted out of the loop, not out of the relationship. Now, other times people do the work and they say, you know what, I realize that we've been in a phase and we've just been mad at each other, and I'm not mad anymore, but I still feel like it's not right. So that's a different kind of outcome, but it's like leaving mad. It's the same thing as it is to marry someone in the merge. You know, it's like we're struck by emotion rather than the logic that this can also change. Very good marriages have very bad problems. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those problems are defining us for a long time. We may be in a long season of winter, but we can come into a spring if we know how to remove the blocks.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, I think this is just such a big stage, you know, in disillusionment, because this is also that part, as we've been talking about, where we seem to look out and realize there are things in our partner that are just annoying us, and how much longer can we tolerate it, even though it seems that it's never going to go away, and it probably never does. You know, in the situation I was describing, I began to find the humor, and just as you were describing that, I realized when you were talking about the keys, that your husband never complained about that, and I realized, you know, that's so true. How rare it was that, for instance, my wife would complain about things that I didn't do. You know.
Yes.
Now, sure, I would go and I would cook dinner. Now, I'm usually really good about cleaning up after myself from the old restaurant habits, but there are times I just may not do it. I may put the dirty dishes in the sink, but I don't maybe totally wipe down the counters and detail everything out all the time. And, well, she lets me have it on that from time to time, too. You spend all this time in the kitchen, and I just can't believe sometimes how you leave it. You know, but the thing, well, honey, I did cook dinner, you know, and I'm not entirely, you know, some people when they cook, they've got stuff strung out all over the place, but the meal's beautiful.
Yes.
But, you know, when you talked about the keys, it made me aware of just how often we don't look at ourselves and say, I wonder what I do that must be annoying the heck out of them.
You've got to be pretty courageous to be able to do that, because it's so much easier to blame our partner and to see what they do. But honestly, I think that is probably one of the best ways I know to reframe it. Because, you know, in the community, so I think that we need certainly the communication skills, and I think that the 80s or 90s were about soulmates. If you meet the right person, everything's perfect. And then we started to get it, that love is a feeling, it's a sentiment, and that a long-term relationship is really a skill set. I think that some of the skills of communication are so essential, but there are other skills that are beyond communication, and I call those self-management skills. You know, the wisdom traditions. Those wisdom traditions, the religious traditions and the philosophical traditions, have emphasized forever those qualities such as patience and tolerance and kindness. And bottom line is, I think that as you grow older, those are where we do the work that give us the best benefits. Somebody did a study, it was the University of Virginia. They did a study where they looked at what was the most important quality in a long-term relationship. They thought it would be lots of sex or good communication skills, conflict resolution, none of it. You know what it was? It was generosity. That generosity was the most important skill that people said is what carried them through. And we've got to be generous. Just like you were so generous in turning that annoyance about the way that your wife does laundry into humor. The generosity of being able to give your partner a break, to learn how to laugh instead of to stay in that sort of grudging, sort of delicious, there is, righteous indignation. That's its own addiction. Generosity to turn that around and to keep doing acts of goodwill with our partner. You know, my husband has brought me a latte every day for 30 years. And some days he brings it to me in bed. And some days he brings it with a smile and a hug. Some days he's busy and he just hands it to me. And there's days he brings it to me with a frown or doesn't say anything with it. Once in a while, when we've been in a pretty hard winter of our relationship, he's actually put it on the other side of the bed, so I have to reach for it to punish me a little. But he brings that latte every day, and that's the generosity, the goodwill that keeps the relationship going through the hard times. So I think generosity is number one. I agree with that.
I think that's a really funny story. For some reason, Forrest Gump pops into mind. And that is, Mom always said a latte was like a box of chocolates. You just never knew how you were going to get it.
That's very good. Yes, that's right.
But this is one of those, and when we'll just talk just a brief bit about it, because I think this is sort of like that Wednesday of the week, that hump day, that if you can get over it, you realize you become into new territory. And that is that in disillusionment, too, that it seems that in a culture like ours, that we try to look at, for instance, what our shortcomings are, I guess, and there seems to be a need or a feeling that there's a need to change those things. But what we're really talking about here is that it's really important for the partner, if they can get to that state, such as I seem to have or you seem to have, is to get to a place where we change the way we experience those things rather than seeing the person change. Because I realize, in my case, for instance, she's never going to change the way she's done laundry. For 10 years we've talked about this, and it's just the way it is. Am I okay with that? Yeah. We're still going to see the sun rise and set. You can always buy a new washing machine. You can always put the shovel in the garage or just leave it. Really, is it that bad?
Well, is it a walking issue? There are certain things that are. I think that a relationship is a total experience of the Serenity Prayer. If you want to know what the Serenity Prayer means, live with another person, because really we can't change another person. All we can change is ourselves. The bottom line is, is this something that's worth leaving the relationship over? Okay, if it's not, get over it. Find a way to get over it. And one of the ways I know to get over it, another thing I did, is I started to think about some of the things that were so wonderful about him. And I would kind of I would find myself getting into sort of this rave in my head, like, I can't believe it. Why can't he just put the sponge away and make such a big deal in my head? And I started to think about the way he is with our grandkids. He's so patient, so much more than I am. And and that kind of replaced the thought, not always, not perfectly, but really a way of changing myself, because what we're really trying to get to is the last stage, the final stage. One of the theses I have in this book, and the theme, is that love is an inside job. So you've opened the door to that so wonderfully. Love is an inside job from the beginning to the end. And that inside job leads us, if we do the work inside, if we're willing to do it and not focus on the other person in the beginning, how wonderful they are, and at some point how impossible they are. But if we do that work, we can end up knowing what it is to be wholehearted. Wholehearted love is the final decision, or the space. And of course, we don't stay there. But once we really know how to be wholehearted, once we understand that, and that's a part of who we are, it affects every part of our life. Empathy grows, humor comes back, our friendship increases. And in order to be wholehearted, we have to know how to manage ourselves. We have to re-image our partner. We have to learn to apologize regularly. And we have to learn, this is a hard one for some of us, to give up being right.
Mm. You know, and it isn't so important, I believe, that we've been expressing here that you need to change yourself or the other person, but you just really change the experience of the relationship if, in fact, staying in that relationship is important to you. Do you feel that a lot of people tend to be impulsive at that stage when you were talking about getting to the point of decision, I've just had enough. I think that I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find something that's more perfect, more like me, perhaps, is really what they are saying. Right. And I'm done with this. And the fact is you don't. You're going to find some things, but for the most part, you're never going to find perfection in someone else. So it sounds to me that you're clearly saying, find that perfection in yourself, and everything else seems to be pretty easy after that, I would think.
Well, you've got to have the right thing you've got to be with the right person to begin with, though. I think that there has to be some kind of essential compatibility beyond just being attracted to each other. Mm-hmm. And that's first, is that if you don't have the right kind of garden, you can't grow anything in it. Mm-hmm. And so if you have fallen madly in love with somebody who is a totally misfit for you, that no matter what you do, the relationship is not going to be right. So that's why the first stage, it's so important to enjoy it, but you need to look for other information when you're choosing a life partner other than how you feel, because the skill set that we need to carry us through, it has a lot to do with the character of ourselves and what the other person is. A person who is so self-centered, for example, to the point where they're not going to get over it, they're not going to learn the skill set of generosity and forgiveness and humor like you described. They're going to keep being self-centered unless something wakes them up, and it won't be love, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think that it has to start with our selection process. Some people select well, and other people have disastrous selections, that's the part to start with, or one part to start with.
Well, it's certainly true that in loving relationships, there's one thing that really stems out about the whole thing, is that you will truly learn a lot about yourself you didn't know before if you're willing to open your eyes and clean that mirror and pay attention.
That's right. That's right, and it changes as we go, doesn't it?
It sure does. I'm remembering, interestingly enough, an episode of The Flintstones. Fred Flintstone actually faced that very thing as he stood and looked himself in the mirror, and his alter ego, or the reflection in the mirror, was saying to himself, because he had gotten to the point where people were just irritated, including Wilma, around him about who he was. Yes. And he says, well, I could live with myself for 24 hours. I couldn't be that hard to live with, I believe, is how it went. And the mirror reflection says, I'll bet you can't live with yourself for 24 hours. And loving relationships, just like money, bring out who we really are.
Yes, that's right. They sure do.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about practicing the 6 C's. Why don't we briefly go through what those are, because I found this here would be a great way to sort of wrap up the show, just to give people, our listeners out there, something to really chew on for a bit, because as you say so eloquently, and I really agree with this, love truly is an inside job, but the more you do that, the more you may appreciate what you have in front of you, or the more you'll look forward to when that right one comes along.
Yes,
that you'll be able to embrace and say, you know what, this is going to be great, because it does. It becomes really, really enjoyable.
That's right. That's right. And I think, if we're focused on what's wrong, then that's what we see. If we're focused on what's right, that's what we see. So the 6 C's. The first is choice, and how I describe that is that to know that we are in our relationship because we choose to be. And what that means is that I know that I can survive without my partner. I don't want to, but I can be okay. I can be okay physically, financially, sexually, spiritually, emotionally. I will survive. That gives me the ability to say, yes, I want to be here. That I see couples where they really feel like they can't live without each other, and they don't like each other very much. But they can't survive. Whichever of those things that I mentioned, they don't think that they could do it alone. So what that causes is a resentment. So this is also part of wholeheartedness, because to be able to know I can survive, I have to know I'm whole inside of me. As a whole person, I choose to be with you. As a whole person who can live on her own in the world, I choose to be with you. That choice is what lets us say yes. The second is committed, but it's not just committed to the relationship. It's committed to doing the work. It's committed to really being honest enough to know where I'm limited in loving, to know where my inside work is, where I may focus on the things that are wrong rather than are right. So it's the commitment to do what I need to do to keep my trouble out of the way. And the third is celebration. This is so important, and it's so important throughout our life. Let our partner know that they're fantastic. Find out what says I love you to them. My husband, for years, I love flowers, and I grow them everywhere. I would say when the daffodils would come up, I would say, why don't you get some on the way home? He'd say, why would I get some? We grow them. But, he started stopping at stands sometimes and getting me a $3 bunch of daffodils. And he'd come in and he'd say, I don't really get this because we have them growing in the yard. But you know what? For $3, it's going to make you happy. Here it is. That meant so much to me. Celebration, knowing that I can find these rituals of connection and ways to let my partner know they're fantastic.
Well, Linda, I do need to enlighten you on that. It's just the practicality side of man.
Yes, that's what it is, and he was willing to overcome it.
We're growing them here, but I'll go ahead and get them anyway. I don't get it, but, that's man.
But isn't that really love? Is I don't get it, but I'll do it because it pleases you. Mm-hmm. That's it. Okay, so celebration. The fourth is compassion, that we all struggle with our human condition, and compassion is being able, we need to do that with clear boundaries. It doesn't mean that we are indulging, but it means that we can understand our partner's point of view. And we have an ability to forget ourselves, forgive our partner. That's part of compassioning, to empathize that life isn't perfect for them either. And then the fifth is co-creation. I think it's one of the most powerful things couples can do, is find creative ways to make their relationship bigger than the two of them. Co-creation can be common interests. It can be a family. It can be saving the sea turtles. It can be just having a rich community life together. But ways that the two of them make something bigger. Friendships, travel, helping each other with what matters, growing a garden, but something that's just beyond staring at each other back and forth. So those are the C's. Did I get all of those?
I believe you did. Courage, I believe, was one I wasn't
courage
sure.
Courage is the last one.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, right. Okay, courage. The courage to confront ourselves, the courage to be able to protest with our partner when something doesn't work, the courage to learn new skills, making changes, and certainly as we grow older, we need that courage to be able to make changes, and finding a way to laugh at ourselves, like what you did. That takes courage too. So I think so that's it. Courage, choice, commitment, compassion, celebration, co-creation, and being brave. Boy, we have to be brave to love well.
You better believe that, and I'll tell you one thing. It took a lot of courage for me to realize over the 10 years that laundry was being done in the way that it was, that, I have never found my television remote control in the laundry, so things are pretty good.
Oh, isn't that great?
But I love that co-creation part. Now, the thing that I think the listeners should understand about your book, Love Cycles, is where it begins to stand apart. And I think you're starting to see this more often in books that are written on the subject, and boy, there are so many of them, is that we get away from, for instance, back in the 1980s, maybe even the 1990s, there seemed to be a lot of talk in these books about communication, how important communication is. And I think, but that can become such a one-sided journey, if you will. Well, I'm going to learn how to communicate just as long as they listen to what I have to say. And that in your book, Love Cycles, you approach this at a more holistic view, where, as you were saying, and I brought up in the earlier part of the show, is that take a look at how you are about receiving that communication. That's a holistic way to look at things. And so you begin to see that if you can approach relationships from a very whole point of view, what do I contribute to this? What do I take from this? That sort of a thing, that you'll find that even though it seems like, and probably is, a lot of work, it really isn't all that hard.
Yeah, well, it's much more work to live in unhappiness, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And I think beyond
it drains a lot of energy, too.
And a lot of money. The bottom line of communication is, though, and this was not something that was talked about in the 90s, bottom line is intention. What is my intention? Is it to convince you that I'm right? Or is it to really try to reach you, a different person, and understand what it is like for you to be you, rather than to try to put what I'm saying on you? So I think our intention is so important in communication, not just the skills, but knowing what we really mean when we say, I need to communicate with you. Is it just a way to whack the other person? I need to communicate with you and tell you how you're wrong. Or is it, part of real good communication means I need to hear your part of it. And that's where we need to be brave also.
Absolutely. Wonderful book for people who would like to explore how they can come to understand themselves. As they say, seek to understand yourself before you reach out and try to understand others. And I think that's so clear, because if we can start wiping off the lenses and clearly seeing things as they really are, we begin to accept things the way they are, and that's when it becomes okay, doesn't it?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Now, Linda, where is a website people can find out more about your work? And have you worked with people? Do they have to be on location, or are you able to do this by phone, by Skype?
No,
I mean, kind of let us know what's going on here.
Yeah, I work on Skype. I work on coaching. I live in Corvallis, and all the Love Cycle weekend programs are there. In fact, we have one next weekend. But I have a lot of clients that I either go to them or I work with them on telephone coaching or Skype or FaceTime. And it's lovecycles.org, lovecycles.org, or lindaacarroll.com. So either of those websites will get you to me, and the book is everywhere. And again, there's a quiz. It's fun. A lot of people just take the quiz, which gives you a sense of what cycle you may be in. And it's just a way to start to get to familiarize yourself with. And I think one of the things that people say they like the most about it is that it normalizes trouble. It says everybody has bad days, bad seasons, bad times, hard ones, and that we can come out of those. It doesn't mean something's wrong. The woman on the airplane who answered the question, leave the relationship if you're not in love, that was such bad advice. If you're not in love, okay, the answer to that is, so what? It's just, this is not necessarily a season that you're feeling it. What can you do to start to bring life back into the relationship? Mm-hmm. And so those feelings have a marvelous way of coming back.
And most importantly, also realize that you don't have to do it alone, that it's a co-creation between the two of you. Is it really that important? I think that there becomes a point when there is trouble in the water, so to speak, that people get to that stage, as you were talking about, about decision where they get to over that hump, of disillusionment, and they say to themselves, how important is this relationship to us really? And I think that there takes a lot of courage just to ask that question for fear that we're not really sure what our partner is going to say.
That's right. That's right.
Fascinating work. Linda, it's been a pleasure to have you here back on the program again. And your website again?
Is lovecycles.org or lindaacarroll.com.
Doesn't get any easier than that. Linda, thanks again for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you.
You bet.
Thanks so much.
So there you go. You have an opportunity to embrace love from a very holistic point of view by simply understanding and embracing yourself first. And boy, when you get that complementary relationship going along with you, it's going to be a good time and a roller coaster ride. You can also find out more. We encourage you to visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, but if you type it in the other way, that works just as well, too. Visit us at our homepage and be sure to become a Beyond 50 subscriber. Get our free e-news updates that come out weekly right into your email news box. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.